Hello and welcome back to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, delighted to be joined as ever with Spike's editor, Tom Slater.
Hello.
And with us down the line, live from Luton, Spike columnist Rakib Ehsan.
Hello.
So plenty to discuss today. We'll be talking about the ongoing fallout from the US presidential elections, the very chilling arrest of journalist Allison Pearson, and finally the tragedy of Gary Lineker. So let's start with the US. Tom, obviously the Trump win is still sending the world into sort of panic mode. He's picking his cabinet at the moment. There's a few things coming out of that. Still, people are trying to come to terms with the fact that so many people voted for him, that he won the popular vote, that he won this broad multi-racial coalition. I mean, are there any things you want to pick up on in particular from last week?
I think it's been interesting as far as the sort of metropolitan liberal establishment, kind of broadly defined in the UK and the US, has realised that some of their old deflections and dismissals about Trump and the people who were gravitating towards him no longer work. It's not like 2016 where they could say this was a white lash, dismiss this as the kind of rattle of white working class rage. Wasn't true that time around, but this time around, given the gains amongst ethnic minorities that we've been talking about and everyone's been talking about, it's very difficult to make that work.
Yeah.
And you do in some places start to see the penny drop. But what I have been struck by is how they still find a way to double down on those arguments. They just have to try and squeeze them into a new form. So it was fascinating on MSNBC, and you had Joe Scarborough saying, now, the thing about this Hispanic vote is that clearly they've got a problem with voting for a woman of colour. So they can still use the kind of racism and misogyny accusations against this new, increasingly multiracial coalition. I suppose the other thing was that a way in which the Democrats could try to avoid some level of accountability for their loss in 2016 was, first of all, to point out that he hadn't won the popular vote, that this was, to a certain extent, the 2016 result was a kind of quirk of the Electoral College. Obviously, they can't do that this time around. They can't, given the fact that, today, it's actually now been confirmed that he's also won the House of Representatives. So he's got the trifecta, the presidency, the Senate, the House of Representatives. He has won the popular vote. He did win all of the battleground states. And again, there's this glimmer of acceptance of that. This isn't the Russians. You cannot just explain this away on the nature of our electoral system. And yet the response again seems to be that, well, maybe the electorate are just wrong, really. Like there's been this repeated sort of claim that Kamala Harris ran the most perfect, in the words of Joy Reid, campaign. And it's almost the voters' fault for not appreciating that. So I guess when we're having a conversation about is there going to be some sort of reckoning amongst liberal left politics for this result, they know they've lost this time around and handily. I suppose that's the difference. But their capacity to double down on their narratives is pretty strong. And I think that does speak to the fact that for a lot of them, they see the world through the lens of an increasingly warped and ivory tower ideology. And that's obviously not going to change just because another tremendous election doesn't go their way.
Yeah, it still reminds us of that really infamous Brecht poem called The Solution, where he advises the government should dissolve the people and elect another one because they obviously are not fit to recognise the great wisdom and talents of their superior elites. Rakib, what have you made of it? You've written a lot about the kind of strange or unusual or unexpected coalition of Trump voters that have emerged, particularly in this election. Do you want to say something on that?
No, absolutely. And first, we have to make the point, it's a spectacular return to the White House for Donald Trump. And I think that what's also remarkable is that Kamala Harris spent, I think, $1 billion in her campaign. But I think the main issue is that many of the mistakes made with this campaign were the kind of mistakes that Hillary Clinton made back in 2016. For example, a heavy reliance on celebrity endorsements, while Donald Trump and Vice President-elect J.D. Vance, it went for more of a sort of podcast strategy. And I thought that was really interesting. But Tom is absolutely right. Compared to 2016, the big difference is that Donald Trump won very handsomely in the popular vote. I think last time I checked, it's 3.7 million votes. That's a considerable margin. And I think crucially took all the battleground states. But the big thing here is that we haven't just seen a voting realignment when it comes to ethnic minority voting. We've witnessed an electoral revolution here. Trump won 46% of Hispanic voters, and crucially is carrying Hispanic majority counties on the US-Mexico border. One example being Starr County in Texas, around 97 to 98% Hispanic. And if you look at the way he performed in 2016 in that particular county, to carry this county now in this presidential election is a remarkable achievement. What was also very interesting in the other racial category, which will include America's diverse Arab and Pacific Islander populations, Trump won the majority of voters. But what was truly impressive in my view was the fact that Trump won 2 in 3 Native American voters. Their so-called figure of European heritage white supremacy, winning 2 in 3 Native American voters. I think many progressives, they just can't wrap their head around it. But if you actually look at the build up to this presidential election, Donald Trump engaged a great deal with Native American communities, including the Lumbee tribe in North Carolina, which is also a very important swing state. He pledged to award this particular tribe with full federal recognition. And once you receive that recognition, that can open up all kinds of funding for economic development, education, and healthcare. But a very crucial point that I'd make is that in Michigan, another swing state that Trump emerged victorious, there was a shift towards the Republicans among Arab Muslim voters. And I think that they naturally vote for the Democratic Party, but they're disillusioned with the Democratic Party's positioning on Israel, Gaza. So I think they're taking a punt on Trump. But crucially, you have socially conservative voters in those minority groups who they can't really relate to the radical cultural liberalism which is taking hold in the Democratic Party. And I think that the Democrats really have to learn a great deal from this. It's an electoral battering. Not just in the presidential election, but in a range of congressional races. But I don't really see much of that at the moment. I see a lot of excuse making. There's a great deal of infighting. And I also think that there's this sort of view that the voters didn't really appreciate how good their campaign was. The reality is if you receive this kind of electoral battering, it means that you haven't run a very good campaign. So it's back to the drawing board. And I think that a serious period of introspection is required.
Yeah, and it's also another sort of mini narrative that it overturned. I mean, people will remember before the election at this big rally in New York, Tony Hinchcliffe, this insult comedian, made a joke about Puerto Rico, calling it garbage. That was supposed to put off all these Latinos from voting for Trump, but the opposite happened, right?
No, absolutely. According to the Wall Street Journal, not only did Trump gain amongst every single Latino ethnic group, but he gained amongst Puerto Ricans by 7 points. And so, as you say, there was this narrative that this joke in particular was going to sink it for them, that, you know, all of their other concerns about the economy, about immigration, about culture, any of these things would be wiped away because an insult comedian said something, you know, off colour at a particular rally. It was always ridiculous. Similarly, coming back to the question of Native Americans, someone on Twitter pointed out that the DNC, the Democratic National Convention, actually began this year with a land acknowledgement. And then they lose the Native American vote so handily. I think within that, you really see, in a nutshell, the fact that we've been living through this period in which the elites have become increasingly identitarian and ideological. In many respects, that's been building for some time, but it's really been turbocharged by the populist era. You know, it becomes their new raison d'etre. We are here to look after these supposedly put upon minorities, whether they like it or not, and we're here to face off against this fascistic new movement in the form of Trumpism and MAGA and so on. And yet, coinciding with that great awakening, you have had the very groups these elites claim to be speaking on behalf of either shrugging their shoulders or actually moving into the Republican column towards the supposed white supremacist, Nazi-adjacent populist leader. So it's such a stunning repudiation to the narrative, capital T, capital N, that I really think at the very least they've got to recalibrate. And you're seeing that in quite a desperate way in a lot of the analysis. I suppose one thing that's does need to be stressed though is that whilst the difference this time around has been Trump having really kind of already locked down the white working class vote, seeing a really significant sort of development amongst the non-white working class vote, non-white college educated vote is how American pollsters tend to talk about it in a sort of rough approximation, is the fact that what you're also seeing here is the fact that this is not just the American liberal establishment putting off ethnic minorities with their paternalistic policies. It's also their betrayal of class issues. That's something that is filtering through in the fact you're having ethnic minorities drift towards the Republican column as well. So yes, it's a revolt against identity politics, but also in a kind of unspoken fashion, it's also a reassertion of the kinds of shared interests and values across class lines that we're seeing show up in this election, as we've seen building over the past 2 elections as well.
Definitely. We should talk a bit about the sort of cabinet, I suppose, or the appointments that Trump is making. There'll be a lot more to chew over in later weeks. But one person I want to talk about in particular is Elon Musk. Elon Musk played quite a central and surprising role in this election campaign, Tom. What have you made of him and in particular the reaction to his appointment? No,
absolutely. I mean, it's interesting how close to the kind of Trump fold he now is, even posing in family pictures at Mar-a-Lago and so on. I do wonder how long that's going to last, because there's certain things that it seems like Musk is very much in agreement with Trump on, whether it's certain questions of the border, which seem to animate him quite a lot, as well as the woke issues and so on. But at the same time, given you are dealing with a billionaire who over his career has taken a pretty harsh line on union organisation and so on, you've also got a huge faction of the Trump sort of world which is very keen to court labour. So at what point these sorts of tensions start to come to the surface will be interesting. But again, the response has been really telling. The sort of Musk Derangement Syndrome has almost been more powerful this time around than the Trump Derangement Syndrome. We've seen that with people leaving X, I would say en masse. I mean, they did have their highest number of deactivations ever on the day after election day. Right. But I suppose it's hard to work out what the scale of this really is. But, the Guardian newspaper has left his social media platform on the grounds that it's being used to peddle misinformation and far-right conspiracy theories. And, the fact that they waited until after the election to do this is probably telling, So it is fascinating, the fixation on him. But I think a lot of it comes down to, again, a sort of low view of voters. There's this kind of sense that the reason it's so horrifying that you've got someone who doesn't agree with us running a big social media platform is because by dint of that, he will hoodwink all of these voters into voting for Trump when, they were clearly heading in that direction long before 2022 when he acquired that platform.
Definitely. Rakib, do you want to add anything? I mean, it just seems as if we're seeing this is another version of what we've seen in past elections where the problem is too much free speech, too much free flow of information. They must have been hoodwinked by misinformation, whether Russian or, in this case, homegrown, as the explanation for the win.
Well, I think that Musk acquiring Twitter, which is now X, is a real political game changer. There's no two ways that has helped to shape political discourse, not just in the United States, but in the West in general. And I think that the appointment reflects that the appointment of Elon Musk within this was a department government efficiency, where he'll be co-leading this agency with Vivek Ramaswamy, who also played a prominent role in the build-up to the election. I think what's very clear is that the Trump-Vance administration wants to be a bureaucracy slashing one. It ultimately wants to reduce the number of federal agencies and fundamentally restructure existing ones. And I think it's very clear that it wants to go and carry a full frontal assault on DEI policy, what they consider to be radical Marxists, extremist left-wing identitarians who have ultimately wormed their way in a variety of institutions and organizations. So one possible positive development from all of this is that those sort of anti-family, racial identitarian theories, which have been exported by the United States quite aggressively to other English-speaking countries in the West, I hope that does stem. I hope that slows down, because there's no doubt there's been a brainless importation of those kind of theories by the contemporary British left. But at the same time, I think that if we truly defend free speech, I think that needs to also allow for at least some of those voices that we all find quite silly, to at least have people have the freedom to express that. But I think that what we need a marketplace of ideas which is more ideologically diverse, especially on university campuses, whether it's in the United States or in the United Kingdom. But there's no doubt for me, if you look at the appointments, I think a very interesting point that Tom made is that how far does this bureaucracy slashing go? Would it involve the deregulation of workers' rights, for example? Now, that would be problematic because Trump actually won impressive levels of support among union households. There's been more of a sort of pro-worker messaging from the likes of J.D. Vance as well. So I think it'll be very interesting to see who he appoints as Labour Secretary. I don't think that appointment has been made just yet, because I think it's a sort of a corporate type which is instinctively keen on chipping away at workers' rights. I think you'd actually be letting down a lot of pro-Trump supporters if you make that kind of appointment. So it'd be very interesting to see how all these potential tensions, how they play out.
Just to tack onto that, I think that's a really important point. I think it's also something which, in his not always explicitly articulated way, Trump gets. I mean, I think he recognizes that the reason that he broke through in the original Republican primary back in 2015 was because he was willing to go against Republican orthodoxy on things like social security, on things like healthcare, that was really something which made a lot of voters give him a second look in a way that they wouldn't. And even when he was campaigning for the nomination this time around, that was something that he would attack his fellow candidates on. Yeah. But obviously last time we saw he finally gets into government and then he ends up with a economic program which is basically written by Paul Ryan and for all the usual kind of Republican elite slurry and tax cuts and so on for the rich. So you do get the sense that he's got a much more serious and committed team around him, keen to give shape to his agenda, but there are clearly competing factions within that, which we'll see play out over the course of the next months and years.
One thing I've noticed lately is that more and more people I know are starting their own business. They're ditching the 9-to-5 to become their own boss. Now, that lifestyle might sound like it's out of reach, but if you know where to look or where to listen, it's actually incredibly simple. It sounds something like this. That's the sound of a new sale on Shopify, the all-in-one e-commerce platform that's revolutionizing millions of businesses around the world. Whether you're selling sustainable coffee or homemade toffee, Shopify gives you the power to reach your business dreams today. Shopify is perfect for budding entrepreneurs, no matter what your age or experience. That's because Shopify covers all of your sales channels, including those critical marketplaces on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Shopify does all the work for you. That's right, you keep complete control of your business without needing to learn any new skills in design or coding. And that's not all. Thanks to Shopify's extensive business library and 24/7 help, you can always stay on track with your business goals. This is Possibility, powered by Shopify. Sign up now for a £1 per month trial period at shopify.co.uk/spiked. Go to shopify.co.uk/spiked to take your business to the next level today. That's shopify.co.uk/spiked. Returning to the free speech question, really chilling event at this weekend on Remembrance Sunday. The journalist, Telegraph columnist Allison Pearson had a knock at her door. There were two policemen. She says that they accused her of a non-crime hate incident. Essex police have since revealed that she's being investigated for an actual crime under the Public Order Act for a tweet that was put out over a year ago but has since been deleted or removed in some way. We don't even know, and Alison Pearson doesn't even know what she's supposed to have said that's caught the attention of the law. I mean, we use words like Kafkaesque and Orwellian a lot in discussions around free speech, but it's surely really warranted in this case.
No, and the caginess that seems to surround this investigation and many investigations like this. You know, you've often had situations where people are being brought in, asked to attend a police interview, as has happened in this case, without actually being told specifically what it is that they have supposedly said, which has led to the initial complaint. And how can you defend yourself on that basis? And also, I think Essex police have also been incredibly kind of tight-lipped about in this investigation, even when it's actually been reported and discussed in the public square. So there's a lot that we still don't know about what tweet this was in relation to, who might have made the complaint. It's worth saying that there's been many instances over recent times of people making complaints, particularly to public figures, kind of maliciously. There was that situation in which We had Amber Rudd having a name put down on the non-crime hate incidents blacklist because of a speech she gave, because a professor in Oxford decided that he took offence to a speech which he later admitted he hadn't actually listened to. So all of these things are swirling around, but it's deeply sinister. Certainly, I think everyone just wants some more information to work out what's going on here. But I think the unfortunate truth is that this is kind of mundane in Britain in the 21st century. I know there's been a lot more interest, and understandably so and rightly so, in the issue of people being visited by the police for things that they've said online in the wake of the past 12 months, and the last 6 months really. But at the same time, it's been going on in the background for such a long time now. Thousands of people a year being investigated, arrested, in some cases actually prosecuted and convicted for things that really shouldn't be crimes, which are just matters of speech and opinion. So yes, I mean, it's one of those things where we really cannot let this become normal, but it has become normal, I suppose, is what I'm saying. Yeah,
Rakib, what are your thoughts?
Well, I just find it amazing what some of our local police forces, what they actually get up to. I'd have thought Essex Police would have more pressing matters at hand on the morning of Remembrance Sunday than knock on Allison Pearson's door over a tweet. And I've never really liked this whole non-crime hate incident. If it's a non-crime incident, then I'm not too sure why the police prioritise these kind of so-called incidents to begin with. If you look at high streets across the country, for example, shoplifting's been de facto decriminalised because of a lack of policing presence in town centres. If you look at neighbourhood crimes such as theft and burglary, I wouldn't say that local police forces are performing very well, many of them across the country. So for me, I think that a lot of this is a fundamental waste of time. And I'd make if I remember correctly, Sir David Emmis, who was murdered by an Islamist terrorist at a church-based constituency surgery, I believe that his daughter's not particularly impressed with how the Prevent scheme, in her view, failed her father, and also the role of the Essex Police is being called into question. So I think the Essex Police maybe should just concentrate on the bread and butter of keeping the public safe, as opposed to hassling Alison Pearson over what she gets up to on X.
Yeah, I mean, clearly it goes way beyond Essex. This is the view of the authorities, right? They have these, insanely skewed priorities when it comes to what they should be dealing with.
No, absolutely. And one thing that I think is slightly undervalued in the discussion, because I do understand when people say they almost feel a bit sorry for these policemen that are being sent out to enforce these crazy laws. But whereas we might not necessarily be talking about individual officers, although I'm sure that does happen from time to time, those powers being abused or those laws being stretched. This is also an issue with kind of police higher ups, with police leadership. It's very clear that there's people at the top of police forces across the country who have latched on to the speech policing identitarian script in order to try and make themselves look good, in order to, as they would see it, repair trust with ethnic minority or other minority communities. It's worth saying that even though, as we say, this particular case is no longer about a non-crime hate incident, the whole thing of non-crime hate incidents was something that was developed by the College of Policing. Yeah, it's not something that was etched in law and then implemented. The clue's in the name; it's a non-crime. They just came up with this system and have continued to use it in quite an Orwellian fashion, even in the face of Conservative government's attempts to clip their wings. All of the initiatives that they would engage in, I think it was South Yorkshire Police, and they had their They had their kind of words hurt helpline that they were encouraging people to call up if someone said something offensive. The number of, I think it was in Merseyside, where they were famously photographed with their kind of rainbow coloured van outside of a shopping centre, basically encouraging people to report people to the police if they'd said any kind of like hurtful speech.
What's the slogan? It was like, being offensive is an offence, or something along those lines.
Which unfortunately is technically true. If you look at certain pieces of legislation, the Communications Act and grossly offensive speech and so on. But they have latched onto this. There is this misconception that, first of all, that this is any of their business, that speech should be any of their business, although unfortunately as a matter of law it is to an extent. But they've also, in many cases, wildly overinterpreted that. So you have all of these almost farcical exchanges, as seemingly might have also taken place with Alison Pearson, where you've got police kind of half understanding the law in order to, harass people for no good reason, because they just have got it into their heads that is what their ethnic minority fellow citizens want them to do.
Yeah.
That they want them to protect them from offence rather than protect them from robbery and violence and so on. So that's one of the things that has made this so difficult to dislodge, is that even though there has been attempts to push back on some of these practices, you have got people in positions of leadership within the police who are pushing very much in the opposite direction.
Definitely. And it's also worth stressing, like, this isn't the first time this kind of thing has happened to a journalist as well. Fraser Nelson was in the Telegraph today talking about how either he or Melanie Phillips was recorded with a non-crime hate incident over a piece that was published in The Spectator. The police really do seem to think that it's their right now to edit the news or to edit our tweets. It's an absolutely extraordinary situation in a supposedly free society for us to have got ourselves into.
And also, just to tack onto that, it's not just non-crime hate incidents either. I mean, this investigation seems to be around incitement to racial hatred under the Public Order Act. It was under that law, from what I remember, that Darren Grimes and David Starkey were investigated over that infamous ill-judged, to put it lightly, comment that Starkey made on Grimes's YouTube channel back in 2020s. So it's something which I think has always been threatening to really breach into the policing of generally kind of right of centre or just un-PC commentary, and we're already starting to see examples of that, definitely. So the Essex Police would do very well to explain what the hell is going on here, but there don't seem to be any prospect of that anytime soon.
Definitely. Right, so let's talk about Gary Lineker, who is parting ways with Match of the Day. Rakib, I think it's fair to say that Lineker is arguably more famous now for his political views than for his commentary, and even for his past excellent sporting glories. Although perhaps not, perhaps he's not a figure we look up to in the culture war.
Well, I think in a footballing sense, he's definitely one of the best strikers that's ever played for England. And I think you almost forget about that, because Gary Lineker nowadays, people mainly know him for maybe quite outlandish political interventions. I think for me, it's a real shame how he's gone about his business, because actually when he concentrates on the bread and butter of footballing punditry, I think he's still excellent. In my view, but I'm not sure, what are the provisions in his contract with the BBC and all the rest of it. But I just sense that that within the BBC, there's been a growing sense that he's probably just talking about politics a bit too much. And people may say, oh, listen, even, former footballers, they're entitled to a political opinion. But I think that when that starts dominating your image while you're ultimately Match of the Day presenter, I think there is a bit of a tension there. And I do think that even when he's been on BBC duty, football related duty, he's still delved into matters of politics. So for me, it's a shame. I think that it's very clear that someone in there's actors within the BBC who clearly are of the view that he shouldn't continue in that role. Truthfully, I've switched off from Match of the Day for some time. I just look at the highlights which are produced by Sky Sports Football on YouTube. They're far more digestible. But what's also very interesting is that when we're talking about who's going to replace Gary Lineker, there was this idea that Mark Chapman and Kelly Summers would be on a rotation system. One week Mark would do it, and the other week Kelly would do it. Apparently Mark Chapman's not too keen on that. I think there's rumours that he wants it all for himself. But what it really shows is that BBC, when it comes to their strategic planning for flagship programmes such as Match of the Day, they don't seem that they have their house in order.
Much more focused on getting the right quota, it seems, if that story is true, Rakib. What would you say is the low light from the Gary Lineker sort of post-Brexit derangement? Because it did flip with Brexit.
Definitely. I mean, there are many such cases, aren't there?
Yeah.
People who slowly were sent a bit off the deep end and just continue to embarrass themselves as a consequence of one vote not going their way. I mean, your video this week on the YouTube channel about David Lammy is another perfect example of this. It did begin with Brexit with him. I mean, it was one of those things where he became increasingly radicalized around that particular issue. And then he just seemed to kind of, buy wholesale the whole sort of mid-wit agenda, So he got really anti-Tory, kind of reflexively anti-Tory, even to the point of indulging in these sort of ludicrous, hysterical depictions of what the last government was doing in relation to immigration as something that was as if it was rhetoric out of the 1930s. That was the infamous tweet, which obviously led to his suspension from Match of the Day, and then all of the other presenters boycotting, and then them having record viewing figures as a consequence. But it was that was obviously such a low point. But really, it was a low point because of what happened later. Was when you had Hamas's pogrom in Israel, truly fascistic behaviour, and it was something that Gary Lineker had nothing to say about around the time. And when he finally did address it on Mehdi Hassan's podcast, he referred to it as the Hamas thing. So it's one of those things where just in terms of all of this rag bag of issues, he seems to just glean towards sort of virtue signalling, midwit opinion. But in a way, I feel a bit sorry for him. It's become a bit of a tragedy that he's become so associated with this rather than any of his other exploits. Because I think, particularly on the liberal left, they have a tendency really to elevate and to turn into a kind of totem anyone who is willing to mouth their platitudes, like whether or not it's useful to them, whether or not this individual has any grasp of what's going on, whether or not they're making the rest of them look bad. Any particularly celebrity who happens to agree with them on a couple of issues, they will turn that person into their Lenin. Like, it's fascinating.
It's Carol Vorderman probably doing that role right now.
Absolutely. There's one after another. And it's not good for the people who they valorize, I think. Only encourages them. You know?
I think he would have been encouraged by the time, well, according to a Telegraph interview, that he walked into the Barnes branch of M&S and received a standing ovation. Although he admits that, of course, people would have been standing in the M&S. Thank you so much for watching the Spikes podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spike's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.